Breaking news tonight. The Supreme Court out with this ruling on the Trump administration and passports. They're now saying that the Trump administration can force people to ID themselves on passports based on their sex at birth, meaning male or female would be the only options. Critics tonight call that a major blow to transgender rights. The court writing in the order that displaying passport holders' sex at birth no more offends equal protection principles than displaying their country of birth. In both cases, they write, the government is merely attesting to a historical fact without subjecting anyone to differential treatment. Let's bring in Laura Jarrett now. And that felt like it is perhaps at the crux of this idea of whether equal protection rights were violated with the Trump administration's moves. What does it mean in practical terms moving forward for example, transgender people, for people looking to identify themselves on their passport?
Yeah, Hallie, this is a super revealing decision for two reasons. One, because, as you say, I think it gives a pretty good window into how the conservative majority views trans rights more generally. Even though this is just on a temporary basis and just as it relates to passports, some of the language there, I think, is pretty frank and strong and gives a pretty candid view. It's also revealing, though, because it now marks yet another example of how this court has decided to treat the Trump administration's use of executive action, Hallie. Remember, this was something that Trump did in his early moments as he took office for the second time.
Okay, so picture this. You're watching Supreme Court proceedings, live footage, audio leaked to the public, and you're seeing something unprecedented. You're watching Donald Trump's lawyers get absolutely grilled by the Supreme Court justices. You're hearing Chief Justice John Roberts questioning whether Trump's use of emergency powers to impose global tariffs is constitutional. You're watching justices express open skepticism about Trump's legal arguments. And then the bombshell, leaked audio reveals Trump in secret strategy sessions with his lawyers. Discussions about sidestepping congressional authority, about using vague statutes to claim powers the Constitution doesn't grant, about expanding executive authority beyond anything the framers intended. And the Supreme Court is calling it out, live on camera for everyone to see. This isn't speculation. This isn't partisan attacks. This is the highest court in the land, including conservative justices, questioning whether Trump violated the Constitution. And it's all caught on tape, the footage, the audio, the constitutional violation exposed in real time. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Basically saying there are only two sexes at birth. And so passport's just one of those ways that the Trump administration is now trying to flex its muscle on that, Hallie. Justice Jackson, Hallie, has a blistering dissent here, writing for the liberal wing of the court, and she kind of encapsulates the real-world impact here, Hallie. She said the plaintiffs and the classes of transgender Americans they represent are forced to make a difficult choice that no other Americans face. She says use gender-incongruent passports and risk harassment, bodily invasions on the one hand, or avoid all activities like travel, opening a bank account, renting a car, starting a new job that may require a passport, or the other. So she's sort of teeing up what the equal protection argument would be, which is transgender people on this issue face discrimination in a way that nobody else does. Obviously, they did not win the day on this, Hallie. As I say, this is now going to work its way back through the courts. But as of right now, that passport policy is on. And it had been off since June when it was blocked in the lower courts. But as of right now, the Trump administration...
This is wild. This is absolutely explosive. Because we're watching Trump get caught violating the Constitution, not by his political opponents, not by the media, by the Supreme Court, the ultimate arbiter of constitutional law, and they're not being subtle about it. Chief Justice Roberts is warning that Trump's use of a 1970s law has never been used for the purpose Trump's using it, that it likely exceeds constitutional authority. Other justices are piling on, questioning Trump's lawyers, expressing skepticism, highlighting how Trump's tariff scheme undermines separation of powers, how it gives the president powers that belong to Congress, how it violates the fundamental structure of American government. And leaked audio captures Trump and his lawyers discussing exactly this, how to sidestep Congress, how to claim emergency powers, how to expand executive authority without congressional approval. And now the Supreme Court has all of it. They've heard the arguments, they've seen the evidence, and based on the questioning during the November 5th hearing, they're not buying what Trump is selling. So let's talk about it. Let's break down what happened at the Supreme Court, what constitutional violations Trump is accused of, what the leaked footage and audio reveal, and why this could result in one of the most significant Supreme Court rulings in modern history. A ruling that declares Trump's actions illegal, that requires billions in refunds, that permanently limits presidential power. Because trust me, this is huge. This is Trump getting caught red-handed violating the Constitution, and it's all on tape. Now, the Supreme Court hearing happened on November 5th, 2025, and it was a marathon session, hours of arguments about Trump's tariffs, about whether the president has the authority to unilaterally impose sweeping global tariffs without congressional approval. And from the very beginning, justices expressed skepticism. Chief Justice John Roberts led the charge. He pointed out that Trump is invoking a law from the 1970s, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And Roberts made clear that this law has never been used the way Trump is using it, that Congress never intended it to give presidents the power to impose comprehensive tariff regimes, that Trump is stretching the law beyond recognition. And Roberts warned that if the court allows this, if it lets Trump use emergency powers this way, it would fundamentally change the balance of power between the president and Congress. It would give presidents unchecked authority over international trade, over economic policy, over areas that the Constitution explicitly gives to Congress. And other justices agreed. Multiple justices, both conservative and liberal, questioned Trump's lawyers about the constitutional basis for these tariffs. They asked how this squares with Congress's constitutional power to regulate commerce. They asked what limits exist on presidential power if Trump's argument is accepted. They asked whether Trump's interpretation would allow future presidents to do essentially whatever they want by declaring emergencies. And Trump's lawyers struggled to answer. They tried to argue that the president has broad emergency powers, that national security requires flexibility, that Congress delegated this authority, but justices weren't buying it. They pushed back. They highlighted the constitutional problems. They made clear that Trump's position is difficult to reconcile with fundamental principles of separation of powers. Now, here's where it gets even more damaging. Leaked audio from Trump's strategy sessions with his lawyers reveals that Trump and his team knew they were pushing constitutional boundaries. The leaked footage shows Trump discussing how to sidestep Congress, how to claim emergency powers to do things Congress wouldn't approve, how to expand executive authority without getting congressional buy-in, and that's devastating because it shows Trump wasn't acting in good faith. He wasn't genuinely responding to an emergency. He was deliberately trying to circumvent constitutional limits on presidential power. He was trying to do an end run around Congress, and the Supreme Court now has evidence of that. They have Trump's own words captured on leaked audio, showing his intent to violate constitutional norms. And based on the questioning at the November 5th hearing, the justices are not happy about it. They're signaling that they're going to rule against Trump, that they're going to declare his tariffs unconstitutional, that they're going to rein in presidential power, and reaffirm that Congress, not the president, controls international trade policy. Legal experts watching the hearing came to the same conclusion. They're saying the Supreme Court's likely ruling will declare Trump's tariffs illegal, will require the government to refund billions of dollars collected through illegal tariffs, and will permanently limit presidential power to impose tariffs without congressional approval. This is a huge deal. This is the Supreme Court stepping in to check presidential overreach. This is the constitutional system working as designed, and it's all captured on footage. Live proceedings showing justices grilling Trump's lawyers, leaked audio revealing Trump's unconstitutional strategy, all of it documenting Trump's violation of the Constitution in real time. So yeah, this is the story. Supreme Court footage shows Trump's secret constitutional violation caught live, justices expressing open skepticism, leaked audio revealing Trump's strategy to sidestep Congress, and a likely ruling that declares Trump's actions illegal and unconstitutional. Let's break it down. All right, so let's dig into what actually happened at the Supreme Court and why it's so damaging for Trump. Because this isn't just about tariffs. This is about fundamental questions of presidential power and constitutional limits. And the Supreme Court is signaling that Trump crossed the line. Let's start with the legal issue at the heart of this case. Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on countries around the world, tariffs on imports from China, Europe, and basically everywhere. And Trump did this unilaterally, without asking Congress, without getting legislative approval. He just declared that these tariffs were necessary for national security and economic reasons, and he imposed them through executive action. Now, the Constitution is pretty clear about who has power over international trade. Article I, Section 8 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, not the president, Congress. The framers of the Constitution deliberately gave this power to the legislature, not the executive, because they didn't want presidents acting like kings who could unilaterally impose taxes and control trade. But Trump claimed he had the authority to impose these tariffs anyway. How? By invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law from the 1970s that gives presidents certain powers during national emergencies. And Trump declared that trade imbalances and economic competition constitute national emergencies that justify his tariffs. And that's where the constitutional violation comes in. because the Emergency Powers Act was never intended to give presidents the authority to completely take over trade policy. It was meant for genuine emergencies, wars, terrorist attacks, real crises where the president needs to act quickly and Congress doesn't have time to respond. But Trump is using it to impose comprehensive tariff regimes, to fundamentally reshape American trade policy, to do things that would normally require congressional approval, and he's doing it all by declaring that normal economic conditions constitute emergencies. And the Supreme Court is saying, no, that's not how this works. You can't use emergency powers to circumvent Congress on matters that the Constitution explicitly gives to Congress. Now, let's talk about what happened during the November 5th hearing. Chief Justice Roberts led the questioning of Trump's lawyers, and Roberts was skeptical from the start. He pointed out that the law Trump is invoking has never been used this way before, that no previous president has claimed the authority to impose comprehensive global tariffs based on economic competition, that Trump's interpretation of the law is unprecedented. And Roberts warned that if the court accepts Trump's argument, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power. It would give presidents the ability to bypass Congress on trade policy simply by declaring emergencies. And once you set that precedent, there's no limiting principle. Future presidents could use the same logic to take over other areas of policy that the Constitution gives to Congress. Other justices piled on. Justice Sotomayor asked Trump's lawyers what limits exist on presidential power under their theory. If the president can impose tariffs by declaring economic emergencies, what else can the president do? Can the president impose price controls, nationalize industries, take over any area of policy by just claiming it's an emergency? And Trump's lawyers struggled to answer. They tried to argue that there are limits, but they couldn't articulate what those limits are. They basically admitted that under their theory, presidential power is nearly unlimited as long as the president declares an emergency. And the justices made clear that's unacceptable, that the Constitution doesn't work that way, that separation of powers means something, that Congress's role can't be eliminated just because a president claims emergency authority. Even conservative justices expressed skepticism. Justices, who are generally deferential to executive power, who tend to side with presidents on questions of authority, were asking tough questions. They were highlighting constitutional problems with Trump's position. They were signaling that even they think Trump has gone too far. And that's significant, because if Trump can't even get the conservative justices fully on his side, if even they think he's violating the Constitution, then Trump is in serious trouble in this case. Now let's talk about the leaked audio, because this is where things get really damaging for Trump. According to reports and leaked footage, there are recordings of Trump in strategy sessions with his lawyers, discussions about how to structure the tariff argument, how to justify using emergency powers, how to sidestep congressional authority. And these recordings reveal that Trump and his team knew they were pushing boundaries, that they understood Congress has the constitutional power over trade, but they decided to try to work around it, to find a legal theory that would let Trump act unilaterally, to expand presidential power beyond what the Constitution allows. And that shows bad faith. It shows Trump wasn't genuinely responding to an emergency. He was deliberately trying to circumvent constitutional limits. He was trying to grab power that doesn't belong to him, and the Supreme Court doesn't like that. Justices don't like presidents who try to game the system, who try to exploit vague statutory language to claim powers the Constitution doesn't grant. And when there's evidence that a president deliberately tried to sidestep constitutional limits, that makes justices even more likely to rule against the president. Because it's not just about the specific policy, it's about protecting the constitutional structure, about making sure presidents don't become kings who can do whatever they want by declaring emergencies. Now, let's talk about what the Supreme Court is likely to do. Based on the questioning at the November 5th hearing, based on the skepticism expressed by both conservative and liberal justices, legal experts believe the court is going to rule against Trump. They're going to declare his tariffs unconstitutional. They're going to say that Trump exceeded his authority, that he violated separation of powers, that his use of emergency powers was improper, and the consequences of that ruling will be huge. First, Trump's tariffs will be invalidated. They'll be declared illegal, which means the government will have to stop collecting them. Second, the government will likely have to refund money already collected through these illegal tariffs. We're talking billions of dollars. Companies and individuals who paid these tariffs will be entitled to refunds, and that's a huge financial hit. Third, the ruling will permanently limit presidential power in this area. It will establish precedent that presidents can't use emergency powers to take over areas of policy that belong to Congress. That will constrain not just Trump but future presidents. It will reaffirm that separation of powers matters, that Congress's constitutional role can't be usurped by executive declarations of emergency. And fourth, the ruling will be a massive political blow to Trump. It will be the Supreme Court, including conservative justices he appointed, telling him he violated the Constitution, that he overstepped his authority, that he tried to grab powers that don't belong to him, And that's humiliating. That undermines Trump's claims of executive authority. That shows even the most pro-executive branch court in recent history thinks Trump went too far. Now Trump is going to attack the ruling. He's going to claim the court is political. He's going to argue that he was just trying to protect American workers. He's going to blame Congress for not acting. But none of that changes the constitutional analysis. None of that changes the fact that Trump tried to claim powers he doesn't have, that he violated separation of powers, that he acted unconstitutionally, and the Supreme Court ruling will make that official. It will be a permanent part of Trump's record, a ruling from the highest court in the land that Trump violated the Constitution. Let's talk about the broader implications, because this case isn't just about tariffs, it's about presidential power more generally. For years, presidents of both parties have been expanding executive authority, claiming more and more power, acting unilaterally in areas that the Constitution gives to Congress, and Congress has largely let it happen. They've been too weak or too divided to push back effectively. But the Supreme Court is now stepping in. They're saying enough, we're going to enforce constitutional limits on presidential power. We're going to make sure separation of powers means something. And that's important, not just for this case, but for the long-term health of American democracy. Because if presidents can just declare emergencies and take over congressional functions, then we don't really have separation of powers anymore. We have an imperial presidency, and that's dangerous. So the Supreme Court ruling in this case, when it comes, is going to be a landmark decision. It's going to be studied in law schools. It's going to be cited in future cases. It's going to shape how we understand presidential power for generations. And it all started with footage and audio catching Trump's constitutional violation live. So yeah, this is where we are. Supreme Court footage and leaked audio showing Trump violated the Constitution. Justices expressing open skepticism, a likely ruling against Trump that will invalidate his tariffs and limit presidential power. Let's talk about what that means going forward. Okay, so let's break down what the Supreme Court's likely ruling means for Trump, for presidential power, and for American democracy. Because this is about more than just tariffs. This is about fundamental questions of how our government works. First, let's talk about the immediate impact on Trump. If the Supreme Court rules against him, if they declare his tariffs unconstitutional, that's a massive blow. It invalidates one of Trump's signature policies. It shows that his approach to governance, his reliance on unilateral executive action, has constitutional limits, and it forces the government to refund billions of dollars. That's money that's already been collected, money that the government has already spent, and now it has to be refunded to the companies and individuals who paid these illegal tariffs. That's a huge administrative and financial burden, and politically it's devastating. Trump ran on being tough on trade, on imposing tariffs to protect American workers. And now the Supreme Court is saying his tariffs are illegal. That undermines his entire economic message. It makes him look like he doesn't understand constitutional limits. It gives Democrats ammunition to attack him as someone who thinks he's above the law. Second, let's talk about what this means for presidential power more broadly. Because the Supreme Court's ruling will set precedent. It will establish limits on what future presidents can do, and that's important. For decades, presidential power has been expanding. Presidents claim more and more authority to act unilaterally, to bypass Congress, to govern through executive orders and emergency declarations. And Congress has largely let it happen. They've been too weak or too divided to effectively push back. But now the Supreme Court is stepping in. They're saying that there are constitutional limits, that presidents can't use emergency powers to take over areas that the Constitution gives to Congress. That separation of powers means something, and that's a check on executive overreach. It's the judiciary doing its job of enforcing constitutional boundaries, and it will constrain future presidents. They'll know that if they try to claim powers beyond what the Constitution grants, the Supreme Court might strike them down. That creates incentive for presidents to work with Congress, to seek legislative authorization, to respect constitutional limits. Third, let's talk about what this means for trade policy specifically. Because if the Supreme Court rules Trump's tariffs unconstitutional, that has big implications for how trade policy works going forward. It reaffirms that Congress, not the president, controls trade. That if a president wants to impose major tariffs, they need congressional approval. And that's how the Constitution is supposed to work. The framers gave Congress power over international trade for a reason. They wanted it to be a deliberative process. They wanted multiple voices involved. They didn't want one person able to unilaterally impose taxes and control trade. So this ruling would restore the constitutional balance. It would force presidents to work with Congress on trade policy, and that's a good thing. It ensures that trade policy reflects broader consensus rather than just one person's views. Fourth, let's talk about the political implications heading into 2026, because this Supreme Court ruling, when it comes, is going to be major news. It's going to dominate headlines, and Democrats are going to use it extensively. They're going to point to it as proof that Trump violated the Constitution, that he overstepped his authority, that he thinks he's above the law, and they're going to argue that Republicans who supported Trump's tariffs were complicit, that they enabled constitutional violations, that they put party over constitutional principles, and even some Republicans are going to be uncomfortable defending Trump on this because it's not just Democrats saying Trump violated the Constitution, it's the Supreme Court, including conservative justices. How do you argue with that? How do you defend a president when the highest court in the land says he acted unconstitutionally? Some Republicans would try. They'll attack the court. They'll claim it's political, but that's a tough sell when conservative justices voted against Trump. So politically, this is going to hurt Republicans. It's going to be another example of Trump's chaos and lawlessness, another reason voters might decide to give control of Congress to Democrats. Fifth, let's talk about what this says about the Supreme Court, because the court's willingness to rule against Trump on this issue shows institutional independence. It shows that even justices Trump appointed, even conservative justices, will enforce constitutional limits when presidents go too far, and that's reassuring. For years, there's been concern that the court has become too partisan, too political, too willing to let their preferred side get away with things. But this case suggests otherwise. It suggests that when it comes to fundamental constitutional principles, the court will do its job regardless of politics, will enforce separation of powers, even when it means ruling against a president from the party that appointed them. That doesn't mean the court is perfect. It doesn't mean there aren't other cases where partisan divisions show through, but it's a positive sign that on core constitutional questions, the court is willing to be principled. Sixth, let's talk about Trump's likely response, because Trump is not going to accept this ruling quietly. He's going to rage. He's going to attack the court. He's going to claim the justices are biased against him. He might even threaten to defy the ruling, to keep imposing tariffs despite the court saying they're unconstitutional. And that would create a genuine constitutional crisis. Because what happens if a president just refuses to follow a Supreme Court ruling? The Constitution doesn't have great mechanisms for dealing with that. It assumes presidents will respect court decisions. But if Trump doesn't, if he defies the court, then we're in uncharted territory. Congress would have to decide whether to impeach, whether to use its appropriations power to stop Trump, whether to take some other action to enforce the court's ruling. It would be a test of our constitutional system, a test of whether institutions can constrain a president who refuses to accept limits. So what's the bottom line? Supreme Court footage and leaked audio caught Trump violating the Constitution. Justices grilled Trump's lawyers, expressed open skepticism about his claims of authority, signaled that they're going to rule against him. And when that ruling comes, it's going to invalidate Trump's tariffs, require billions in refunds, permanently limit presidential power, and establish that even in the Trump era, even with the conservative Supreme Court, constitutional limits still matter. This is a turning point. This is the court stepping in to check presidential overreach. This is the constitutional system working as designed, and it's all documented. Footage of justices questioning Trump's arguments, leaked audio of Trump discussing how to sidestep Congress, all of it showing Trump's constitutional violation in real time, and soon the Supreme Court will make it official. They'll rule that Trump violated the Constitution, that he overstepped his authority, that his tariffs are illegal, and that ruling will be a permanent part of Trump's legacy. A definitive statement from the highest court that Trump acted unconstitutionally. Stay tuned, because when that ruling comes down, it's going to be major news. It's going to reshape debates about presidential power. It's going to hurt Trump politically, and it's going to reaffirm that in America, no one is above the law, not even the president.